Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging headfirst into, well, a truly fascinating and, I have to say, a little strange corner of history. We're exploring something often called pneumatic magic in the Renaissance. It's a system of thought, a kind of science, maybe? A worldview that feels dramatically different from how we understand things today.
Definitely different.
It's all about how people back then thought about the body, the soul, the cosmos, and the astonishing ways they believed these things could interact through subtle, unseen forces. So our mission in this deep dive is to take the material you've shared with us specifically, this incredible chapter on pneumatic magic, and really dig into the core ideas and practical applications described. We're focusing on the concepts laid out across pages 107 through 129.
Right. And to make any sense of this at all, we absolutely have to start by grasping what pneumatic meant in this context. Because, yeah, we're not talking about tires or air pressure, obviously.
Not hydraulics.
Not hydraulics, no. Here, pneumatic refers to this concept of a subtle spirit or a vapor, a vital force, maybe a medium. It was understood to exist within every living being and within the cosmos itself. This spirit, the pneuma, was seen as a crucial intermediary. So within a person, it was the link between the physical body and the immaterial soul.
Yep.
And then on a grander scale, it was the link between the earthly realm and the celestial spheres. It literally connected heaven and earth in their view. Understanding this pneuma concept it's absolutely fundamental.
Right.
It's the key, really, to unlocking many spiritual, medical, and what they considered scientific processes during the Renaissance that, today are often completely misunderstood or just dismissed as superstition.
Okay, let's really unpack this then, starting with that core concept the chapter focuses on, the phantasma pneuma. The source points out that this wasn't necessarily Aristotle's brand new invention. It sounds like he skillfully took pre-existing pieces from earlier traditions and kind of assembled them into a significant influential system.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. He synthesized things.
So why is this ancient concept, this phantasmic pneuma that Aristotle helped consolidate, why is it so profoundly important for understanding the Renaissance worldview centuries later?
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, and the source makes a strong case here. It argues that without understanding the deep historical lineage and the nature of this phantasmic pneuma, many interpreters looking back at the Renaissance have they've missed the fundamental essence. The underlying unity of a whole range of seemingly separate spiritual, and again, what they considered scientific processes.
So it wasn't just a fringe idea?
No, not at all. Quite the opposite. The source posits it was a principal central theme, a concept that even represented, and this is a great phrase, a horizon of hope. It was deeply, deeply embedded in their entire understanding of reality, how it worked, and, humanity's place within it. And the historical lineage, as the source traces it, is pretty expansive. It shows its deep roots. We see early versions of this spirit idea tracing back to ancient Sicilian medical doctrines.
Sicilian, really? Okay.
Yeah. Then there's the figure of Diodes of Carystus. He was a physician, contemporary with Aristotle, possibly even a precursor. The source intriguingly suggests it's entirely possible Diodes actually inspired Aristotle on this.
Yeah.
Not the other way around, which is what people usually assume. And this concept, especially the idea of a principal part of the soul or spirit, the hegemonicon, was developed further, perfected really, by the Stoic philosophers. They refined this idea of a pervasive spirit governing both the cosmos and the individual mind.
So it goes from medicine to philosophy and then loops back into medicine, is that right?
Exactly. From the Stoics, this pneumatic theory of cognition and how things worked re-entered medicine in a big way. This happened through the school founded by Athenaeus in Rome, 1st century CE.
Okay.
His main advocate and successor was Archigenes of Epimea, who practiced in Rome under Emperor Trajan, early 2nd century. These physicians, they really integrated the Stoic pneuma concept deeply into their understanding of physiology and mental processes.
And Galen, who's such a giant figure in medicine, he built on this too.
Absolutely. Galen, 2nd century, huge influence. He was deeply inspired by these earlier pneumatic physicians. He took their ideas and made some really crucial modifications. One of the most important was shifting the location of the hegemonicon, that principle governing part from the heart, where some earlier traditions like Aristotle had placed it.
Right. The heart makes intuitive sense somehow.
It does, but Galen moved it to the brain, and crucially, he assigned it a very specific function, semesthesis.
Semesthesis.
Yeah, it means synthesization, the active process of combining and integrating pneumatic information received from the senses and other sources. This was a key step in developing the theory of internal mental faculties operating through this spiritual medium.
Wow. Okay, so how did this complex ancient knowledge survive the fall of Rome and make it into the Middle Ages to become so fundamental later on?
All right, good question. The source explains this transmission was primarily through Arab translators and scholars, figures like Constantine the African Kainan. An amazing figure, actually. After a life of travel, he settled in Monte Cassino in the late 11th century.
A monastery.
Yeah, Benedictine monastery. He dedicated himself to translating vast numbers of Arabetical works into Latin. And these translations circulated widely, bringing this pneumatic theory back into European thought. Then, in the 12th century, you have the great translator Gerard of Cremona working in Toledo, Spain, a real intellectual hub then. He rendered even more complex works into Latin, including those of the Persian polymath Avicenna.
Avicenna, right.
Heard of him? Yeah. In Avicenna's work, The Theory of Phantasmic Synthesis, how imagination combines sensory data and the idea of different compartments or faculties in the brain processing pneumatic information, these were already highly developed. Commonplace, really. So by the 12th century, thanks to these translations and scholars building on them, this concept of the phantasmic pneuma was widely accepted. It was fundamental to how influential thinkers understood the mind people like Bartholomeus Anglicus, the encyclopedist,
Okay.
Albert the Great, Roger Bacon, Thomas Aquinas,
Yeah.
all these big names. Bartholomeus, especially, is highlighted as reflecting the standard pneumatic and psychological concepts accepted throughout that whole medieval period.
So the main takeaway from this history lesson is that this wasn't some obscure, weird idea. It was well established, centuries old. A concept of a subtle spirit tied to imagination, senses, the brain. It just persisted and became totally foundational for the Renaissance thinkers.
Exactly. Foundational is the word. And the source strongly emphasizes the function of this pneumatic synthesizer, this internal medium. It's considered the primary body of the soul.
The soul's body.
Kinda, yeah. Think of it as the soul's direct physical vehicle or instrument. It's described as residing in the head, specifically in the ventricles of the brain, like a fortress, an acropolis.
A fortress in your head.
Right. This is the crucial spot where visions and images are formed. And the process of knowing things, in this view, isn't just passive receiving. It involves actively comparing external objects perceived by the senses with intellective marks, pre-existent ideas or forms already in the soul.
Okay, so you compare outside stuff with inside stuff.
Precisely. And this comparison, this complex integration, is facilitated by this pneumatic mirror inside the head. It reflects both the celestial prototypes, the ideal forms from the higher spiritual world, and the sensory data from the external physical world. It's the dynamic mechanism bridging the gap between perception, memory, understanding, all operating through this subtle spirit.
Fascinating. Okay, so moving from that core idea of the pneuma as this intermediary, the source then introduces a classification of magic. It mentions D.P. Walker distinguishing between subjective and transitive magic. What's the difference, and how does this still tie back to the pneuma?
Right, so Walker, a modern scholar, suggested this categorization. Subjective magic was basically practices aimed at working on the magician themselves.
Like self-help, almost.
Sort of, yeah. Self-transformation, purification, preparing your own spirit or pneuma. Transitive magic, on the other hand, was aimed outward, affecting external objects or other people, influencing events, causing love or hate, attracting things.
Okay, that sounds more like classic magic.
It does. However, the source makes a really crucial point here that kind of collapses this strict separation. It argues that ultimately all magic is transitive, even when it seems subjective.
How so?
Because of the pneuma, because of that principle of continuity we talked about, the unbroken connection between the individual pneuma and the universal pneuma, the world spirit. So even influences directed inward, aimed at changing the magician, still operate through this connection. Any change in your personal pneuma is understood to resonate, to connect with the universal pneuma, and through that influence the external world. It can't not be transitive in this view. And the mechanism described for this, even from an internal state, is quite specific. An image, a powerful thought, a desire. It's first conceived in the magician's mind, in their spirit.
Okay.
When this image is formed, with enough intensity, enough concentration, it's believed to acquire actual existence, a reality of its own, within the phantasmic spirit, the spiritus imaginarius, that pneumatic synthesizer.
So the image becomes real inside you.
Real and active. It's not just a passive picture. It's said to emit rays or subtle pneumatic emissions like light or heat. These rays travel outward and affect external things or people. The effect is similar to how the actual thing itself would exert influence. There's a direct correspondence. The powerful image in the spirit links almost causally to the thing produced or influenced in reality.
So if I'm getting this, It's like the power of imagination, but understood not just mentally, but as a physical emissive force, like a subtle energy that shapes reality because everything's connected through the spirit.
That's exactly right. Imagination is a potent, real force mediated through the pneuma. And the source is incredibly explicit about the central role of fantasy of the imagination. It says fantasy is the main entrance, the porta et principius editus, for all magic processes.
The main entrance.
Not just an entrance, the only gateway, the sola porta, for internal mental states, images, intentions to manifest outward or affect the external world. And maybe most tellingly, it's called the chain of chains, the vinculum vincularum.
Wow.
Because it's the absolutely necessary intermediary, the vital link connecting sense perception to the higher intellect. Nothing you see, hear, touch, whatever, can reach the intellect for real understanding without first passing through and being processed by fantasy.
The chain of chains, that really gives it huge importance. And how does Eros love fit into this idea of fantasy being the ultimate vinculum?
This is where it gets even richer, especially with Renaissance figures like Ficino and Bruno. Eros, understood broadly sensual pleasure, desire, the power of fantasy to create compelling images, is presented as the ultimate vinculum, the strongest bond of all.
Stronger than reason.
In terms of binding power, yes, according to this view. The source explains that individuals and even things are manipulable or connectable according to different criteria. But the fundamental chain of chains, the bond that universally ties individuals together and things to other things, is Eros. It's the principle of attraction, desire, connection, mediated through imagination. Marsilio Ficino, the Florentine Neoplatonist, wrote a lot about the power of love and imagination linking minds and things, drawing on this tradition. But it was Giordano Bruno, that fiery 16th century philosopher.
Bruno, right. He got into trouble.
He certainly did. Bruno is credited here with taking this identity of love and magic, which Ficino had outlined, and, well, he really ran with it, took it to its logical conclusion. Bruno viewed magic not just as rituals or spells, but as a legitimate science, a deep understanding based entirely on knowing and skillfully manipulating these fundamental bonds, these vincula that connect everything, and the primary vinculum, Eros, operating through fantasy.
Okay, so if magic works by manipulating the pneuma, using fantasy, using these erotic bonds, what were the actual practical techniques? The chapter mentions purification, diets, stones, sounds, shapes. What did that look like day to day?
Right, this is where we get into the specifics, the tangible, and sometimes, quite strange practices described. The main goal often was to refine, purify, elevate your own internal spirit, your pneuma.
Make it more heavenly.
Thematically, more heavenly, more pure, more resonant with the world spirit or celestial influences. This meant actively purging filth, anything coarse, impure, antagonistic to that subtle heavenly essence. And the purification methods detailed weren't just about, taking a bath, though cleanliness was important. It involved carefully avoiding certain foods believed to dirty or weigh down the spirit.
Okay.
But they also recognized that stains could come from the soul itself, negative thoughts, emotions, and external factors too. The condition of your skin, your clothes, where you lived, even the air you breathed. It was totally holistic.
Was the air you breathed or the clothes you wore could literally affect this subtle spirit inside you. Wow.
Exactly. Everything carried pneumatic qualities you could absorb. Then there was the significant use of objects, especially precious stones. Stones were huge.
Heraldments and things.
Yet worn as talismans, crafted at the right astrological times, or even taken internally ground up in potions. The belief was stones absorbed specific planetary qualities. By using them, the magician impressed those qualities onto their own spirit.
For protection or power.
Both, yeah. Enhancing traits, protecting the body from plague or poisons. Aligning yourself with powerful celestial forces embodied in the stone. The source mentions the Chaldean oracles describing using stones, herbs, incantations, specifically to purify the vehicle of the soul for mystical ascension. The magic of sounds and shapes was also potent, especially as described by Al-Kindi, whose work was known then. Sounds had astrological or elemental correspondences.
Like certain notes match certain planets?
Kind of, yeah. Specific musical notes or vocal sounds might resonate with Jupiter or fire or whatever. Their power was thought to be doubled when their inherent meaning from celestial harmony coincided with the meaning humans gave them. This connects to early Kabbalistic ideas about a natural language, like Hebrew, where words intrinsically reflected the essence of things.
Okay, I see.
Magic shapes, characters, symbols had similar properties. They could influence things or attract forces through sympathetic resonance, operating pneumatically. And sacrifices, too, mentioned by Al-Kindi. The violent death of an animal in ritual was seen as creating a literal breach in the macrocosm.
A breach.
Yeah, an opening in the world's spirit, through which the magician's will could enter and change circumstances. And of course, the animal chosen had to match the goal, symbolically.
The chapter gives that really specific anecdote about a theurgist's daily life.
Yeah.
That sounds like it brings it all together.
It really does. It's a vivid snapshot. It describes a theurgist, someone practicing divine magic, trying to connect with celestial beings going through their day. They'd wear a clean white wool gown for purity, practice rhythmic breathing, probably to control the internal pneuma, avoid cold air, maybe seen as disrupting the spirit, play the lyre, specifically for Apollo or the Graces, to attract their good pneumatic vibes through music.
Okay, sounds quite ritualistic.
Very. Their meal is frugal cooked vegetables, lettuce focusing on a simple purifying diet, but then the really specific additions.
Uh-oh.
2 rooster hearts.
Seriously, eaten.
Eaten, yeah. Believed to strengthen the theurgist's own heart by absorbing the rooster's vigorous pneumatic essence. And similarly, a sheep's brain to strengthen their own brain, the seat of the phantasmic pneuma.
Rooster hearts and sheep's brain. Wow, that really underlines the literal belief in absorbing qualities and ground amethyst in wine.
Exactly. The anecdote mentions mixing ground amethyst powder with sugar and wine, specifically as a ritual or potion to get the favor of Venus. And cleanliness is stressed throughout. These details show this very literal belief in absorbing specific pneumatic qualities from substances or actions to alter your spirit, health, constitution, aligning with cosmic forces.
So the core idea is actively absorbing the quinta essentia, that 5th element or vital spirit, from natural sources rich in it.
Precisely. These are the gifts of the animate world. Plants, animals, stones, anything believed to be a reservoir of pneuma. The principle is, if you know how to identify and isolate substances containing this quinta essentia, or use things abundant in it, you draw it into yourself, strengthening your own pneuma. The source gives another example from Vita Coelitus Comparando, a life compared to heaven. If you wanted Jupiter's qualities, you might literally squeeze yourself between things associated with Jupiter on Jupiter's day and hour.
Squeeze yourself between things.
That's what it suggests. Or to attract Venus qualities, use turtle doves, pigeons, wagtails, things linked to Venus. And it's all tied to planetary influences. The whole world was structured by them. Different planets govern different activities, body parts. Saturn for philosophy and occultism, Jupiter for politics and natural philosophy, Mars for conflict, courage, Sun Mercury for eloquence, glory, Venus for festivities, love, Moon for nourishment, change.
So your horoscope dictated your medicine too.
Absolutely. Planetary influences dictated astrological remedies. The core idea, as the source puts it, natural and artificial things have occult stellar qualities, and using them exposes our spirit to those stars.
And timing is everything. Propitious times.
Crucially important, the tempora opportuna, the right time. Picking herbs, making talismans, casting spells, it all depended on planetary positions, relationships, houses. The source mentions rituals involving visualizing the forms of planetary angels, like Orpheus for Saturn.
Visualizing them?
Yeah, suggesting that forming specific, vivid mental images, phantasms of these beings was key. Again, highlighting fantasy as the link between the human mind and the cosmos.
So this whole worldview had real consequences, shaping how people saw major historical events. The chapter shifts from personal practices to broader moments, talking about astrological conjunctions, especially 1484. What was the big deal about 1484?
Right. The source discusses the influence of conjunction theories, drawing on Al-Kindi and Al-Bumassar. Al-Kindi proposed that Jupiter and Saturn had regular conjunctions, little ones every 20 years, greater ones every 960 years.
960 years, wow.
Yeah, and these greater conjunctions, especially when they shifted between elemental signs, were believed to have enormous influence, causing floods, earthquakes, famines, but also shaping major political and religious events, inaugurating new eras, predicting the rise and fall of empires, religions. This theory was widely known and influential thanks to Al-Bumassar. Roger Bacon used it to predict the birth of significant figures, prophets, false prophets, founders of movements linked to these cycles. He listed Alexander the Great, Jesus, Muthanni, Muhammad, all within this astrological framework.
So what was expected for 1484 specifically?
Based on this tradition, there was widespread expectation. A major conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter was due in the triangle of Aquarius, an air sign. So many people across Italy and Northern Europe genuinely anticipated the coming of a significant religious figure, a little prophet, bringing new religious understanding. The source mentions Paul of Middelburg, Bishop of Urbino. He wrote his prognostica around October 1484, addressing these expectations. He tried to stretch the timing, thinking the effects would last 20 years, so he expected the prophet around 1503.
And the source quotes what this prophet would be like.
Yes, it gives a glimpse. The quote describes someone who would offer an excellent interpretation of the scriptures, provide responses concerning the divine, and rally human souls. It also notes astrologers debated the birthplace south or north, maybe a moderately warm, humid country. It wasn't just abstract stuff, it was specific, widely discussed.
That's incredible. Was this just about prophets, or did it get linked to other major events?
The source mentions syphilis, which is surprising. It is a dark and striking connection the source makes, showing how these interpretations were applied retrospectively to make sense of disasters. The source notes that, a posteriori looking back from the early 16th century, the 1484 conjunction was blamed for the syphilis epidemic that swept Europe after Charles VIII's campaigns in Naples in 1495.
They blamed the stars for syphilis.
They did. Joseph Grunpeck, an astrologer at Maximilian of Austria's court, provided a detailed astrological explanation in 1517. He explicitly blamed the 1484 conjunction. His reasoning: France was ruled by Jupiter, seen as hot and humid, so the conjunction started the disease there and it spread. This interpretation, the source notes, lasted centuries, even echoed by Astral in the 18th century. Shows how ingrained these ideas were.
Wow. And how does the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, the witch hunter's guide, and the witch craze connect to 1484 in the source's view?
The source suggests a direct, though complex, link. The papal bull Summis Desiderantes Effectivus, issued by Pope Innocent VIII, recommended repressing witchcraft in Germany. This bull came right after Innocent met Henry Institorus, one of the main authors of the Malleus Maleficarum.
So the Pope met the author, then issued the bull.
Seems that way. The bull was in 1484. Malleus published around 1486. Now, the really widespread systematic witch hunting didn't peak until later, 16th, 17th centuries, especially escalating with the Reformation.
Right.
But the source argues the 1484 bull was a significant official signal, an impetus from the top, legitimizing the pursuit of witches, even if the church later stepped back from prosecuting in some areas. The timing, 1484, right after this astrologically significant conjunction, is presented as probably not coincidental. A climate of anxiety may be fueled by astrological fears, meeting this official push against witchcraft.
Okay, so moving into the next big force discussed, the Reformation. The source presents it as a major challenge, actively working against this whole phantasmic culture. How did the Reformation challenge these ideas about magic, imagination, the Pneuma?
Fundamentally, yeah. The source argues the Reformation radically altered the human imagination in the West by asserting the idolatrous and impious nature of phantasms, the images formed by imagination.
Idolatrous.
Yes. And since, as we've discussed, many Renaissance sciences, pneumatic magic, astrology, certain medical practices, memory arts were built on using phantasms as legitimate tools, well, they were undermined, overthrown by this new theological stance. The core conflict, as framed here, was the Reformation's intense focus on returning ad fontes to the pure source, the Bible, and rejecting Christianity's medieval engagement with pagan philosophy, Neoplatonism, Aristotle.
Right, getting rid of the extras.
Exactly. Reformation theology stressed God's infinite transcendence, absolute otherness separate from creation. This led to a powerful rejection of pantheism, the idea, embraced by Cusa or Bruno, that God is in nature, perceivable in the material world. Nature, in this newer view shaped by the Reformation, became increasingly seen not as a path to God, but as the realm of the fall, source of sin, corruption, something the soul needed saving from, through grace and faith in a transcendent God, not by engaging with it pneumatically.
That's a huge shift, and the source uses Pascal as an example of someone caught in this change.
Yes, Blaise Pascal, brilliant mathematician, philosopher associated with Jansenism, which had resonances with Protestant ideas. His famous terror contemplating the infinite silence of space. The eternal silence of these infinite spaces frightens me is partly attributed by the source to this sensibility. He embodies the feeling of clinging to an abstract, inhuman world concept where God is withdrawn.
So his fear wasn't just existential, it was theological.
The source links it to that shift, yeah. Contrasting Pascal's fear with the Renaissance view where God was everywhere, the universe alive with spirit, accessible through pneumatic understanding, this also impacted ideas of human freedom. The source contrasts Pico della Mirandola's Renaissance oration, celebrating human freedom to ascend, connect with higher beings through knowledge and imagination, with the agonizing responsibility felt by someone like Kierkegaard centuries later. That freedom, without God manifest in the world, without nature as a ladder, became a crushing burden. God's perceived silence became nature's silence, too.
Did the Catholic Church react differently? Did they hold on to the Renaissance view?
Interestingly, the source argues no, not really. That spirit of severity and abstractness from the Reformation ended up, perhaps surprisingly, suiting the Catholic Church too, especially in the Counter-Reformation. Yeah. The Counter-Reformation moved in similar directions. Increased dogmatic rigidity, severity, harshness, abandoning the more open, syncretic positions explored during the Renaissance. The source argues a kind of generalized Puritan fear and hardening prevailed across both sides. This ultimately led, in this view, to expelling God from the world by trying to save the soul from science and nature.
And this rejection of phantasms, this move towards abstraction, it might have hammered things like the art of memory, using images in astrology.
Absolutely. Direct impact.
Yeah.
The source mentions attempts, even as this shift happened, like Bruno trying to create a Christian sky, replacing zodiac signs with virtues vices to make astrological memory more abstract, Christian, trying to adapt.
Did that work?
Not really. The source contrasts this with earlier medieval attempts, like replacing the ram with the Lamb of God, or later ones, Schiller using apostles, Schickhardt using biblical interpretations. But these efforts had little chance with, say, English Puritans.
Because they hated images.
Exactly. They'd cast icons out of church's idolatry. They favored abstract memory systems like Ramos's logical structures. To Puritans, using zodiac signs or apostles in this visual, imaginative way was just creating new idols of imagination, tying the mind back to the dangerous phantasms they wanted to escape. The whole visual, imaginative approach was suspect. The source also brings up the Copernicus heliocentric versus Ptolemy geocentric debate in this light. It highlights opponents like Father Mersenne in the 17th century weren't primarily arguing based on astronomical truth or evidence.
Why then?
Often, it was theological anxiety, a desire not to disturb people's peace of mind with radical ideas challenging religious frameworks, an attitude the source sees echoing that cautious, fearful Puritan mindset. This contrasts with someone like Cardinal de Bérulle, who saw heliocentrism's simplicity as potentially reinforcing theology by showing God's rational design. The source views preferring complex geocentrism over simpler heliocentrism here as a serious miscalculation, driven more by fear than truth, or even practical sense, shows how deeply non-scientific factors, rooted in these religious imaginative shifts, influence scientific debates.
It's just striking how interconnected it all was. Cosmology, memory, religion. And the source even connects these shifts to broader cultural changes, like views on women and beauty. That seems like a leap.
It is a striking connection the source makes, weaving social and intellectual history. It links the traditional identification of women with nature, prevalent since the Middle Ages, seen in Maleficarum, calling women the evil of nature, and men with culture religion, to changing beauty ideals and increasing repression after the Reformation's focus on controlling nature and flesh.
So how did beauty ideals change?
Well, in the medieval view, natural beauty, especially attributes linked to fertility, hips, breasts, was often religiously suspect, linked to temptation, sin, leading to a more ascetic ideal, inner virtue over body. The Renaissance, contrastingly, showed signs of, as the source puts it, permissiveness, even promiscuity, pointing to mixed baths, dances, frank literature like Boccaccio, art showing the body more naturally. Women's clothing revealed more sometimes, a greater openness to natural physicality.
Okay, so more open than more repressed.
Exactly. The source describes a later shift, using Spain as an example in the Counter-Reformation era. Repression returns strongly. Fashion becomes restrictive. High-heeled Chopins, encouraged by the church, partly because they made dancing difficult. Black, severe clothing. The ideal shifts to women with no bosom, even using lead plates to flatten breasts.
Lead plates. Ouch.
Yeah. And this repression connects back to the witch craze. Physical traits celebrated or shown in the Renaissance: wide hips, prominent breasts, buttocks, long hair, become associated with witches, seen as naturally anti-conformist temptresses, embodying the evil of nature needing suppression. The witchcraft literature and imagery, the source argues, often became pornographic, obsessively focused on the female body and sexuality in distorted ways. It served as a screen for projecting the persecutor's own fears and repressions.
Projecting their own issues onto the accused.
That's the argument. Using examples like Hans Baldung Grain's engraving of witches with a demonic dragon, or descriptions of disheveled women being suspect. The latent content was projecting personal inhibitions onto these marginal figures, embodying the other nature, women, the uncontrolled flesh that the culture wanted to repress.
It's a powerful argument about projecting anxieties. And this focus on the devil manipulating phantasms brings us to the Faust legend, discussed in relation to erotic magic and temptation.
Right. The source delves into the Faust legend's origins in this context, tracing the name Faust not just to German tradition, but back to Simon Magus, also called Faustus, an early Gnostic antihero seeking union with Helen, seen as fallen wisdom.
Okay.
This connects to another tradition, St. Cyprian of Antioch, or his friend Aglaïdas, desiring the beautiful Justina. When she, a Christian virgin, rejected him, he made a pact with the devil for her soul.
The classic deal with the devil.
Exactly. But the devil couldn't force Justina's free will due to her faith. So what did he do? He used erotic magic and phantasms.
Back to the phantasms.
Couldn't force her will, but could influence her imagination and desires. Tried to excite her, awaken her dormant natural being, encourage her femininity, hoping she'd succumb. The source quotes Calderon's play vividly, infernal spirits unleashing lascivious spirits, filling Justina's fantasy with 1,000 base phantasms, making birds, plants, flowers provoke love, trying to distract her.
Did it work?
No. And here's the key point highlighted. The devil failed because Justina had free will, strengthened by faith, illustrating the limitation of phantasmic magic. The source jokes the devil made a theological error, should read a text saying free will can't be influenced, only imagination via phantasms.
It's like the phantasm can show you the most tempting vision, but it can't make you act against your will if you choose not to.
Exactly. It operates through imagination and natural inclination, not overriding rational or spiritual will. And the source takes this long thread, ancient Pneuma, Renaissance magic, Reformation rejection, changing body views, Faust legend limits, and draws it forward unexpectedly to the modern world and even warfare.
Chemical weapons. How on earth does pneumatic magic lead to chemical weapons? That seems like a huge jump.
It is a provocative argument, for sure. It brings up Johann Rudolf Glauber, a 17th century chemist who lived through the 30 Years' War. Glauber envisioned a future German universal monarchy achieved through economic and technological supremacy.
Okay.
And within this vision, he specifically recommended chemical weapons pressure tubes for spraying acid as more effective than gunpowder, partly to stop the Turks. The source uses this example to argue our civilization still operates within the trenches dug by the Reformation and subsequent events. Modern warfare, increasingly in labs, abstract calculations, is presented as a fatal result of the Reformation's influence, detaching us from nature, focusing on abstract power. An outcome Nietzsche might have foreseen, linked to the death of God, nihilism. Processes the source links back to separating God from nature, rejecting the pneumatic view.
So the argument is suppressing phantasmic imagination, rejecting nature as divine, shifting to abstract principles, led in part to modern abstract technological warfare.
That's precisely the source's challenging argument. It contrasts the subtle, flexible magician state, not literal wizards, but a system operating through internal changes, metamorphosis, influencing via subtle bonds, imagination, rhetoric.
Right.
With the rigid, inflexible police state defending outdated values through coercion, force, abstract rules, detached from human desire and imagination. While the magician state might seem better, the source notes it often exhausts itself internally, lost in subtle machinations, unable to neutralize the crude hypnosis of the police state's brute force. Yet despite the police state's dominance, the source posits, maybe hopefully, that the future might belong to magic's subtle processes understood as a deeper science of connection, influence, imagination over brute force.
This has been, wow, a real deep dive into a worldview that feels incredibly alien, tracing these ancient ideas about spirit, imagination, magic, shaping daily practices, hygiene, major events like predictions, witch crazes, the Reformation's impact, social norms, beauty, the self, and stretching, according to the source, right up to early ideas about chemical warfare.
What's truly fascinating is seeing how deeply embedded these ideas were, influencing everything from diet to interpreting epidemics. It really challenges our modern neat separation of science, magic, religion, psychology, politics.
Absolutely. And seeing the source's argument about how rejecting this phantasmic worldview during the Reformation shaped what came after, leading, in its view, to aspects of our world today, it really makes you pause, doesn't it? It makes you wonder about these hidden currents in history.
And it raises an important question for you, our listener, to think about. The source ends this chapter with a hope, maybe utopian, maybe just a thought experiment for a new renaissance, a rebirth that could overcome modern divisions, neuroses. It suggests this would need a new reformation, not religious, but a profound modification of human imagination itself, setting it on different paths and goals than those established when the phantasmic was suppressed. What might such a fundamental shift in our collective imagination look like today in the 21st century? And maybe more importantly, if it happened, would it feel friendly and benign to those living through it?
A powerful, maybe even unsettling thought to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this exploration of the surprising history of pneumatic magic. We hope it offered you some truly fascinating insights and perhaps sparked some new ways to think about the deep, often hidden connections between history and our present moment.